Welcome to South Sudan, the youngest nation on Earth. Born in 2011 amid hope and aspirations for a better future,
a nation is born. The symbol of its sovereignty and identity flies for the first time.
But today, the country grapples with formidable challenges, from political instability to economic woes and entrenched poverty. In fact, South Sudan can lay the claim to the unfortunate title of the poorest country in the world, with the lowest GDP per capita adjusted to purchasing power parity. But why? The country is blessed with massive oil reserves, so by rights should be a wealthy nation. However, political circumstances of the past and present have pushed the country into economic turmoil with the worst living conditions possible. So what is behind South Sudan's precarious economic situation? Who is responsible and how? Let's find out. First of all, what's it like in South Sudan today? As things stand, 80% of South Sudanese live below the absolute poverty line. This means that 80% of the people have less than $1.90 US to spend every day. This is a threshold considered to be necessary for the provision of basic human needs such as food, clothing, and shelter. This isn't about living comfortably. 80% of South Sudanese don't even have enough to survive day by day. In the Human Development Index, which is a composite measure of a country's average achievements in three basic aspects of human development, mainly health, knowledge, and standard of living, Sudan is pretty much last at 185 of 189 countries. Infant mortality rates stand at a dismal 105 per 1,000 births, with nearly 1/5 of children lacking essential vaccinations, exposing them to preventable health risks. To give you perspective, the infant mortality rate in the USA is 5.6, and in the EU, it's 3.3 for every 1,000 live births. Pretty horrifying stuff. But the hardships don't end there. Imagine having to walk for 30 minutes just to fetch drinking water, a daily reality for 38% of South Sudanese. And for 80% of the population, access to basic sanitation like toilets remains a distant dream. The lack of access to basic cleanliness leads to further spreads of diseases, which, once again, the country does not have the resources to manage. Both South Sudanese rely on sustenance agriculture to sustain their livelihoods, but ongoing conflicts and adverse weather conditions often thwart farming efforts, perpetuating a cycle of poverty. Which leads us to our first reason. Number one, endless wars and conflict. To give you context, South Sudan has been in some type of war or conflict for the majority of the past 70 years, even before its independence in 2011, when it was part of the current state of Sudan. The pre-independence conflict is commonly referred to as the Second Sudanese Civil War, which lasted from 1983 to 2005, and this followed an earlier conflict, the First Sudanese Civil War, from 1955 to 1972. The North and the South of Sudan used to fight over cultural, religious, and ethnic differences between the predominantly Muslim Arab government in the north and the largely Christian and animist African populations in the south. The Second Sudanese Civil War in particular was one of the deadliest worldwide conflicts since World War II. It severely impacted South Sudanese society. Roughly 2 million people died as a result of war, famine, and disease caused by the conflict. It eventually led to a referendum in January 2011, with 98% of South Sudanese voting for independence, and thus a new state was born out of war.
What was Africa's largest nation is now split into two.
However, peace did not last long as the South Sudanese Civil War began in 2013. Tensions escalated when President Kiir accused Vice President Machar of attempting a coup in December 2013, which Machar denied. This accusation led to violence in the capital Juba, which quickly spread across the country. Although a peace deal was reached in August 2015, and a transitional government formed in April 2016, renewed fighting broke out in July 2016, involving additional armed groups, particularly from the southern Equatoria region. By April 2018, it was estimated that about 400,000 people, 10.6% of which were children, had been killed in the war. A revitalized peace accord was signed in September 2018, aiming to end the war, establish a unified national army, and prepare for elections. However, delays in implementing the agreement have led to increased violence and severe food crises, with 7 out of 11 million South Sudanese needing humanitarian aid since 2020. As of now, the country remains a presidential republic, with President Salva Kiir at the helm of a transitional government before new elections, and Riek Machar remains the VP. Now, they may call it a transitional government, but to be honest, where's the change? Things are pretty much the same, so What was all the fighting for? Next, an infant state with no resources. At independence in 2011, South Sudan had a major problem. It was completely impoverished. Like a newborn without inherited wealth or sturdy infrastructure to lean on, the nation struggled to find its footing from the get-go. It's a story of a baby state destabilized from its very birth. Decades of conflict have left scars that still mar South Sudan's landscape today. The echoes of warfare continue to disrupt economic activities, with industries and infrastructure in shambles, leaving the majority of the population dependent on subsistence farming and aid just to survive. Infrastructure, the backbone of any thriving economy, is painfully lacking, which stifles any type of economic growth. A mere 2% of its highways are paved, making it almost impossible to move goods and services efficiently through the country. Electricity, primarily generated by costly diesel generators, reaches a paltry 2% of the population. Indoor plumbing and clean water, essentials of modern living, are non-existent for most. So the struggle for basic amenities is an everyday battle. Education too faces immense challenges, with a shortage of schools, qualified teachers, and educational materials hindering learning opportunities. Illiteracy is shockingly high, with only 20% of the population able to read and write. Now, South Sudan is an incredibly diverse nation, home to hundreds of tribes that form the mosaic of cultures and ethnicities. Now, while diversity may breed equality in certain parts of the world, in South Sudan, it has been a source of tension and conflict, where power struggles among the country's political elite have often aligned along ethnic lines. By far, the two largest groups include the Dinka, representing about 35% of the population, primarily inhabit the northern and central parts of the country, and are led by President Kiir. Meanwhile, the Nuer, consisting approximately 20%, are mainly found in the Greater Upper Nile region and are represented by former Vice President Riek Machar. The remaining 40 to 45% of the population consists of dozens of smaller ethnic groups, including the Shilluk, Azande, and Barl, and many others, each consisting much smaller percentages. These ethnic conflicts have colonial roots. During the colonial era, administrative boundaries and policies often favored certain ethnic groups over others, sowing seeds of division which are still prevalent today. The previous Sudan civil wars were generally fought over religious grounds, and the recent civil war erupted in December 2013 between forces loyal to President Salva Kiir, who was Dinka, and Vice President Riek Machar, who was Nuer. The violence quickly spread across the country along ethnic lines, causing widespread displacement and hunger. Next, South Sudan relies heavily on its oil exports for its revenue, and it accounts for nearly all of its foreign exchange earnings. The economy is not diversified, and other sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, and services are severely underdeveloped. The country earns 90% of its revenue from oil sales, since it has 5 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, making it the 24th most rich oil state. Recently, oil output has decreased by 1/3, and as a result, income has decreased by almost 75%. In addition to this, the civil war and increased military spending has contributed to a shortfall of foreign exchange reserves. As a result, state coffers have been exhausted, leaving the transitional unity government with insufficient financial means to weather macroeconomic slumps. In this struggling nation, markets falter, property rights are almost non-existent, and economic signals falter. The private sector faces significant constraints due to rising inflation, a weakening national currency, hard currency shortages, and high energy costs. In addition, the war removes any trust from the economy, which leads to a lack of development. Following independence, neighboring countries like Kenya and Ethiopia expressed a strong interest in investing in South Sudan, but failure to execute any kind of economic reforms and infrastructure development has negatively impacted investment, investor confidence, and business costs. Furthermore, following South Sudan's independence, it has had constant conflict with Sudan over oil resources. As South Sudan is landlocked, it supplies crude oil by pipeline to Port Sudan, Sudan's Red Sea port. The neighbors have constantly disagreed over boundary concerns and pipeline transit fees. Sudan was charging South Sudan $36 per barrel, which is significantly above the industry standard of closer to $1. In 2012, South Sudan halted oil production for over a year in protest against Sudan's alleged siphoning of oil and high transit fees. This drastic measure severely impacted both economies, with South Sudan losing its primary revenue source and Sudan losing significant transit fee income. In addition, South Sudanese forces launched an attack in April 2012 on the disputed Panthao oil-rich territory on Sudan's southern border. Although this conflict was eventually resolved and the countries came to an agreement, it's still a source of tension between the two countries. South Sudan has looked at developing other pipelines to lower its reliance on Sudan, but this has many cost and logistical challenges, and being in a constant state of war makes it close to impossible to implement. Next, power-hungry and corrupt politicians. To summarize corruption in South Sudan, conflicts in South Sudan are caused by ethno-political wrangling and competition amongst the elite over access to power and financial resources. In 2022, the Corruption Perceptions Index, or CPI, by Transparency International, South Sudan ranked 180th out of 180 countries, making it literally the most corrupt country in the world. Corruption festers at every level of government, siphoning off precious resources by the country's elite that could be used to lift the country out of poverty. Now, we've already spoken about the country's complete dependency on oil, and reports from the United Nations and various NGOs have documented the embezzlement of oil revenue by South Sudanese elites. In fact, in 2012, President Salva Kiir admitted that approximately $4 billion in public funds had been stolen by government officials since independence. This revelation underscores the scale of corruption in the country's nascent administration. Now, this is back in 2012, so you can only imagine what that number is now. And there have also been reports of food aid being embezzled by those in power. This corruption saps resources from public services, such as healthcare and infrastructure, further perpetuating inequality. And last but not least, South Sudan is particularly vulnerable to climate shocks, ranking as the second most at-risk country on Inform's Climate Risk Index. Every year, families endure devastating floods, forcing hundreds of thousands of people from their homes, causing extreme levels of malnutrition, and leading to outbreaks of waterborne diseases. This makes life even harder in a country already facing a lot of problems because of conflicts and other issues. Droughts have also hit South Sudan, ruining farms and killing animals. To stay safe from floods and droughts, some animal herders have moved their animals away from their usual routes. But this has led to fights with settled communities, especially those who've recently returned to South Sudan after living elsewhere. So, in conclusion, these are the major reasons behind the current poverty in South Sudan. And unfortunately, once again, it's mostly due to human actions. It's difficult to find a country in a situation as bad as South Sudan. The country has been hit from all sides, from constant conflict, poor infrastructure, an economy entirely dependent on one resource, corruption, and even climate disasters. While the country is relatively stable right now, under the transitional government, this could change, and honestly, the entrenched corruption and environmental disasters paint a bleak picture for the average population. So what do you think could be possible solutions to the South Sudanese crisis? Do you think that there are international factors and agents behind it all? Let us know in the comments. We'd be glad to hear your views.